The late 1970s or the real early 80s, the cost of long-distance transportation began to sneak up on we poor drunks who had rolled across the dark cracks of this great nation on the cheap, asses stuck to warm vinyl seats. Prior to this inflation, for a while anyway, getting from here to there and maybe even back again was cheaper than farting in a diner. For some reason, I seem to remember the fare's transition into extreme affordability was engendered by the bicentennial, but the truth is I was tripping way too fucking hard in those days to notice exactly what the hell was going on anywhere with any precision. Regardless, with Greyhound and Trailways both offering $54 tickets to anywhere in the continental U.S., I floated like a feather across the lower 48 incessantly, doing what I could where it could be done, and enjoying the spectacle of all those forgotten paths. During the course of these ceaseless yo-yos across North America's crust, I learned many useless things. Thankfully, I've since forgotten most of them. In fact, the only one I can easily conjure up right now was told to me by some guy named Don at a lunch counter in one of those towns I'd previously imagined to be a poetic figment of the imagination of Little Feat's Lowell George. Maybe it was Tucumcari, maybe it was Tehachapi, maybe it was Tonopah. I can't rightly recall, but it was one of them. Don and I had been sharing a bottle of something cheap heading west on the bus earlier. But this was a rest stop, so we were drinking coffee, because a lot of the drivers, if they smelled booze on you, would put you off the coach and make you wait for the next one, which could make for a long day or a long night in whatever bum steak of a town you had happened to be enjoying your strong waters. Anyway, we were sitting at this counter, Don and I, drinking weak coffee and talking about women we had met on buses and what manner of making out was possible in the rear seat and or elsewhere. Don, like myself, was a guy who enjoyed pleasures where he found them, but he advised me in no uncertain terms that regardless of how smooth the road might appear, it was a very extremely poor idea to perform cunnilingus in the bathroom of a moving bus. This is almost the only counsel I can recall from this period of my life, but it is advice that has served me well, and I trust it will also be helpful to you, should you ever find yourself on a date with access to a rolling commode. This is called a Hymn of Scent, which I wrote right after John Fahey died. John Fahey, the great kunaclaster, bound too tight by the universe, just as he was by clothes and even by skin, all designed to be worn by a mere mortal, which he was not, has left his meat empty and untended, but not forgotten and not unloved. For in the memories and the future trajectories of 1,000 nights, and of 1,000 trips, and of 1,000 glides through the ether, his haunting presence, if not quite as big as life, nor quite as smelly as life, still twirls long fingers like dark crystals refracting endlessly through the royal of eternity. And he gave so much of himself and of his essential whatsis that the stain he left on our planet, which was merely another sofa to him, will never be fully erased, no matter how hard they scrub. This one's called Sun Valley, and actually I lived in Sun Valley, Idaho for a while in the 70s. It was quite a town. Mouth filled with shit and dirt and teeth. Looking around at the parking lot back of the Lucky Lady Bar in Ketchum, I contemplate my options. On one hand, I could return to the bar and either slink back onto my stool or try to sandbag the knucklehead who jumped me, or just pretend nothing happened. On the other, I could lay here for a while, appreciating the view and the sky, or I could even get up and walk back home. At least I guess I could. Fuck, it's cold tonight. And it's really kind of comfortable lying here. I'm down below the wind and this dirt's not all that hard, so maybe I'll just lie here for a good long while and watch to see if the spirits of my ancestors have a more evolved sense of social responsibility than I've ever been able to muster, except when I ask one of my girlfriends to stop littering. This is called 1-2. On checking my mail today, tax day, the day on which our participation demonstrates once and for all that we believe ourselves to be citizens of the United States, I have discovered that not one, but two men whose work made this life the most bearable form of all known forms of life have had their spirits wiped from the planet without a whole lot of fanfare. On the face of it, there would seem to be little connecting Sandy Bull and Joey Ramone. But having stood in the same room conversing with both of them, albeit on separate occasions, it is possible for me to make a few rough generalizations about their commonalities. Both were tall, both were thin, both were generous with themselves and with their fame, or at least, from my observations, with the road toward fame and the road away from it. And certainly in my life, both had important places. The first time I played pinball with Joey at CB's in 1976 was assuredly the first time I really understood the possibility that my physical skin sac and non-physical thought sac might be connected to any kind of culture more widely dispersed than the people in my immediate social circle. A revelation responsible for kicking me in the direction of whole new forms of poverty and ecstasy. And even though Sandy affected me through his music more than through his physical presence, which was quite ghostly by the time we connected in flesh, there's no denying the fact that the splendor of his lateral runs on E pluribus unum cut deep furrows into my brain during those months I was first spending serious time with acid, months which in retrospect were as influential as any I have ever lived. And I guess they're still both with us, Joey and Sandy, in one sense anyway, because you or I or anybody can reach out and grab one of their records and put it on the box and bring them as close as either ever got to actually visiting most of our houses while they were still alive. But it's not really the same, because I know in an elemental way I will never play another game of pinball with Joey Ramone, as though I'd actually been to CB's in years. And I know I will never fly down to Nashville and sit with Sandy Bull to hear his story the way I felt it should have been heard, as though I could ever find an editor who cared. And these facts chip away at my sense of well-being and of my sense there is something right in the world. In the deepest way, it is ever more apparent that important parts of my culture, the culture of the underground, are being washed away and are not being replaced by anything as truly world-beating as that which we lose. And where does this really leave any of us when we want to unplug from the world as it is presented to us? And now that I'm looking at my taxes, I'm starting to wonder why the fuck there aren't numbered lines and empty spaces where I can indicate that I, taxpayer, have given $1,000 to Joey Ramone, so that he could record some crazy duets with Ronnie Spector and really get that shit happening, or that I, citizen, have given some money to Sandy Bull to help him release those archival tapes he always talked about, to get them unspooling into the ears of my fellow countrymen, who are dealt such a handful of turd in the guise of culture, they do not know and could not guess what precious things have just been removed from their presence forever. Can we really be as oblivious as we seem and continue to exist as a country in which people actually live? When you think we are paying money to keep that fat scumbag Cheney's heart from popping like a grape, and to have Strom Thurmond's colon scraped for bugs, it has really got to make you wonder what the hell we are doing, and why on earth, on this earth, we are still bothering to do it. These are a couple that I went to college with Ken Burns at Hampshire, and we actually had a video collective in the 70s, and he was a fucking dick then. But when he was doing that jazz documentary, it was just the nadir of like anything. And a friend of mine was his like chief cameraman, and so we kept on telling him like, oh, you know, Thurston and I were like, oh, you know, we'll like help you out with like doing some avant-garde jazz stuff. And he was adamant about the fact that he didn't want to have anything to do with that stuff, really. So anyway, so these were a couple poems that I wrote, and I would email them to him. The first one's not that specific, but the second, well, I'll read the second one first. Ode to Burns 2. Louis Armstrong, 100 years young this very year. Devil hater, woman fucker, improviser, weed smoker extraordinaire. In this year, Louis, your angelic bones have been rubbed like ivory, have been sucked like cocks, have been licked like nips, have been gnawed like jerky by Marsalis, and Crouch. Sounds like a law firm, but is in reality an infirm trio of turtles rolled onto their backs, soft bellies to the clouds, awaiting anointment by you. And I picture you, bursting into their office, angelic eyes blazing red from pounds of gauge rolled and smoked as fast as angelic hands can roll and angelic lips can smoke. And your angel's face splits open when you see them, two-legged poodles lolling for treats, their little chodes wagging like children's fingers. You laugh so hard you start coughing, and your angelic lungs and your angelic mouth well with a fluid so thick and so dark and so hemped it is like some special kind of honey. And you cover these simps in a thick gout of stuff that hardens right up and seals them away forever. And the age of the bow-tied fuck draws to a close for us all. This is the other one for Kenneth. There's a fire burning and Mingus is on the box, and as so often happens when Mingus is on the box, I'm thinking of D. Boone. The music of Mingus and the soul of Mingus and the volume of air displaced by Mingus rarely fail to bring that other great American into my mind. The vision of Mingus on the eve of eviction, firing his shotgun into the ceiling of his loft with a grin of surprised delight, reminds me of a show at the T-Bird Roller Dome in Fullerton. The stage that night was a too-high pile of risers, stacked in a way that was none too stable. When the super heroines played, you didn't really notice how wobbly it was. But when the Minutemen played, they'd move around quite a bit. And every time D. Boone shouted "motherfucker" into the mic, he'd jump into the air. And when he landed, those risers shook like crazy. D. Boone shouted "motherfucker" a lot, so the stage shook a lot, and every time it shook, D. Boone got the same little grin Mingus got when he emptied his shotgun into the air. And the music of Mingus, as the music of D. Boone, blasts through the dark reaches of the universal nothing, setting ablaze brains that have been so long seized by cold they have become their own engines of nada. For the collective sake of whatever is left, let us hope the future of this world is never one in which the match that is Mingus and the match that is D. Boone have been lost to our brains and to our souls forever. This one's called Beat Meat in the Catskills, and it's this was actually a show that I think Thurston and Dan Ireton and I went to. Walking into a Fugs reunion in Woodstock, New York in 1999, it is not easy to maintain an erection. The skins of the wild who frolicked in Tompkins Square in the dimly remembered years of Johnson hang like moths on coats forgotten at a party someone crashed in a distant lifetime. Fat guys who used to deal drugs but don't anymore because they've found bigger things to push are the only ones whose outer layers don't seem loose, somehow unattached to meat or to bone. What sins required them all to don these fucking sackcloths, I can only guess. But I hope it was fun then, because it sure looks like the piper's paid now, and I don't mean that as an ageist. Honest. This one's called Go Tigers. It was from a thing Christina Carter put out called Lady Hair. They were all poems that included the phrase lady hair. Albert Einstein and Lester Young became good friends during the year Lester taught a workshop on improvisational thinking in the physics department at Princeton University. In one downbeat yearbook, there's a great photo shot by Art Kane in the lounge of the Princeton Faculty Club, showing Lester and Albert sitting by a big bowl of scotch and ice. Albert is sticking out his tongue and sort of lapping at the stuff humorously, while Lester has a long metal straw stuck into the bowl and he's sucking on it languorously like a pasha at a hookah. Lester is laughing and Albert's eyes are all crinkled up like he's been laughing too. And that was, I suppose, typical of their relationship, since Lester told Leonard Feather in a contemporary interview only published years later that Albert, quote, was a sweet, jokey little motherfucker with a real crazy do. Einstein never made public comment on his friendships in the jazz community. But in his journal, there's an entry dated March 3, 1950, where he notes, "Had a great session today with Prez and Little Jazz. We played some of Gigi's wonderful old songs, and Prez started calling me Lady Hair. I can hardly wait to see the look on Benny's face when I tell him." Both Young and Eldridge outlived Einstein by years. But there's a recording in the Library of Congress archives of them playing a beautiful set of duets on the Gershwin themes that Einstein so loved at his funeral. Billie Holiday was there also, but she did not sing. This one's called Superman 2. It's another one in my series of dead guy poems. Never having had the pleasure of knowing Ken Kesey except through presentations of his public persona and a brief correspondence, I can only speculate what he actually imagined the nature of the prank to be. But it was a concept my friends and I grasped intuitively, if not necessarily correctly, loosely imagining it as something like a dictate to keep the normals on their toes. This was an idea that possessed us, body and soul, for decades. And indeed, I'm not sure we ever gave it up so much as we had it ebb away from us as we came to resemble ever more closely the prankees rather than the pranksters. And this may have been true of Kesey as well, but it sure never looked like it from where we sat, in the cheap seats, digging his act and just enjoying the shit out of the fact that he was still up to his old tricks, even if the prank now seemed somewhat less than the platonic ideal we had once dreamed it was. And it still remained forever beyond us, although it could seem tantalizingly close at times, to imagine the fullness of what it must have been like to walk in the prankster's shadow when he was young, and at the height of his powers, and on a tear, pouring salt into the wounds, right straight into the goddamn wounds of J. Edgar Hoover live on the radio with Roger Grimsby. Any guy who could do that, who would do that, who would say that, while he was on the run from those fucking G-boys, knew more things than most of us ever could about making the bastards churn in their spermy bathwater. And we viewed Kesey's hubris as its own beautiful reward, and something like the most perfect prank imaginable. Because it always seemed the true nature of the prank itself was not necessarily benign or even safe. And if this fact was one lost on my pothead pals, it was also one that achieved a certain clarity after you'd spent enough time crawling through the bubbles of acid time, discovering the genius of creation, lurking in acts of destruction or even annihilation. Anyway, all I can offer in return for all the knowledge, all the fun, and all the thinking I received from Ken Kesey is a salute to a man who made the world a finer place for living, and a hope that his memory will sustain the many more generations of pranksters this planet surely needs. This is one from a lady here also. It's called The Wilson School, which was the name of the grade school I went to in Jersey. 63. I do not consider myself to be a hair fetishist, yet I have been moved more than once to one extreme emotion or another by the artful shake of a woman's bangs. This may well be due to the fact I had my first sexual glimmerings during that portion of the 60s in which bangs and heavy eye makeup were worn by the most savory of the older girls at my school. And when one of them would deign to make eye contact with me at lunchtime, perhaps across the room and from under her personal teepee of hair, I would feel a change in my body's relative pressure, as though she had, in fact, appeared naked, standing alongside my bathtub at home while I showered, parting the plastic curtains slowly, beckoning to me with nothing more than well-controlled, insanely long, and artificially thickened eyelashes. This one is another dead guy thing. It's called A Threnody for John Easley and Jim Shepard and Glenn Spearman and Dick Higgins and Ray Bremster. There was a period where it just seemed like a lot of people I knew were dying, and every time some of them would die, I'd just write poems for them. I don't know why. Anyway, it would be disingenuous to say that all my friends are dying, or to suggest that everyone I know who's dying was my friend, but this fall, 1998, a year or 2 years before the millennium, the cold wind that usually sweeps my spirits up every year at this time of year seems to be blowing so fucking hard that people are flying right off the goddamn planet. I don't know. In general, when the leaves come off the trees and the color comes off the hills, my sense is we're getting a chance to see things as they really are. To see the bones of the planet without the usual stuff dolling it up, and that feels good. But this year, the grayness of the rock and the rocky grayness of the cloud sheets hanging and shifting over the top of my valley seem to imply a blandness of spirit creeping up on us, trying to offer a future infinitely duller than the future we'd imagined. John Easley was what, maybe 30 or so? I hadn't even seen him in years. But my memory of his massive bulk, flung sideways through the air while he blatted punk lyrics in front of a bunch of Harvard kids, is pretty fresh. Now he's gone with a bang. My connection to that whole scene feels far more tenuous than I could have ever imagined. Jim Shepard was my age and a little, mid-40s or something, I guess. And Jim could be a difficult guy, but he was one of our era's great inventors. His musical vision so personal and so homemade. He'd already overcome so many problems, it always seemed like he had the stuff. That he'd figured out the alchemy of turning his problems into art. And that's the only thing that'll save any of us. So you've got to wonder where that leaves a lot of other people who weren't Jim's equal. Glenn Spearman was 51, and Jesus had been so sick for so long, you almost started to think he was right. Maybe he wasn't sick. But I guess he knew it was the end, not long after he was back east that last time, and I guess he was right. On one hand, I'm glad he died the way he did, in bed and not in some goddamn punk alley in Oakland, but man, I wish I could hear him play one more time. Because he was, for me, more than anyone else I've known, a connection straight to the heart of original jazz freedom. Dick Higgins was 60 or so, and I only ever saw him do a performance once, in New York a long time ago, and I never really met him except through letters I wrote him a couple of times. Because when I did see him at parties in the city a few other times, I was really just a kid. And he seemed pretty weird and imposing the way 40-year-olds do when you're 20 and drunk and in a place you're not really supposed to be. Or at least since you're 20, you don't think you're supposed to be there. But there are aspects of Higgins' thinking that have colored my way of doing things more than any real teacher. And the thought that there will be no more of his new projects on the horizon makes me feel kind of lightheaded. Ray Bremser was in his 60s too, although he looked like he was a million. And goddamn, I guess he was sicker as shit when we saw him in Cherry Valley. But you wouldn't have known it. He really had his wily geezer act down. And it sure as hell seemed like more than half his barrels were firing, since he honestly gave us as good a raft of shit as you'd get from someone half his age who was feeling every one of his oats, which he wasn't. But Weinberg says when he last saw Ray in the hospital about 2 hours before he died, Ray was asking to hear some Coltrane, which would make for a pretty good passage. So I guess he had his act together till the end. I can only hope that John and Jim and Glenn and Dick had something approaching the beautiful transportational power of Coltrane's visions blowing through their heads before the wind washed over them that last time. Sometimes self-righteous turds like to say something good comes from death, that there are lessons taught, there are dreams passed on, there's a natural rhythm to existence which predicates a certain number of snuffs. All this may be so, and all these guys fucked death in the ass enough times that perhaps they could no longer confound it by the constant motion of their brains and their souls and their bodies. But there are no lessons to be learned from their deaths. There is only a sense that there are now 5 fewer backs to push against the envelope and help us keep the great gray mass from becoming a permanent condition, a heavy static haze slowly binding the efforts of everyone who's still around fighting entropic gush in big ways or small. It would be wrong to say these heroes have not left vestiges, but what can we do except burn their bodies and scatter their ashes and hope that we or someone can keep building castles of resistance on a mound of dead fighters that grows slowly higher every year? I'd like to think the clouds I see this fall are the smoke of Kathy Acker and William Burroughs and Herbert Huncke and Allen Ginsberg and Jack Micheline and Dennis Charles and Robert Palmer and everyone else whose death has preceded my own. But I don't think it's so, and that more than sucks. Maybe next year when the trees go bare and my world turns into a granite quarry overnight, I'll be able to see it with fresh eyes, but this fall, this motherfucking mountain of a fall, 1998, I ain't into it. And I may never be into it quite the same way again. I can read one more or not. John? Yeah?
Yeah.
That'll bother.
Yeah, I don't want this one recorded though.